Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and this is RegWatch by RegulatorWatch.com. The FDA's war on vaping just lost its general. Brian King, the embattled director of the Center for Tobacco Products, has been ousted, removed in a sweeping purge by the Trump administration, as it remakes federal health agencies from the ground up. King claimed to support harm reduction, but under his watch, the FDA blocked flavored vapes, buried the science, and left adult smokers out in the cold. Now, with the architect of prohibition gone, the path may finally open for a regulatory reset. Is this the beginning of Trump's promise to save vaping? Joining us today to discuss the potential impact of Dr. King's ouster is Jim McCarthy, president of Counterpoint Strategies and agency of record for American Vapor Manufacturers, the AVM. Jim, thanks for joining us again today on RegWatch.
Always a pleasure.
Now, we've got a lot of good news, I guess we could talk about with King, but there's some really bad news this morning that we heard with regard to SCOTUS. Please fill our audience in.
Yeah, setback at the Supreme Court this morning. The court ruled 9-0 today to send the vape case, Wages and White Line versus FDA, back to the Fifth Circuit. And in the opinion that came out, which again was unanimous, the court sided with a lot of FDA's arguments about, how their regulatory process was sound and that they, didn't mislead companies. And but the court did zero in on a important aspect of misconduct by the agency having to do with whether marketing plans were required, and so it sent it back to the Fifth Circuit with some guidance on the jurisprudence. And so we're still in the ball game, and our hope is that the Fifth Circuit will strengthen the arguments that it made when the vape companies prevailed there last year, and that the plaintiffs will again win at the Fifth Circuit, and the strengthened argument will prevail there. And of course, there's other cases in other federal circuits which get at other aspects of the way FDA has bungled the PMTA process. So there's a lot of battle left, and we're going to fight another day. But it was a setback this morning.
Now, we know you're not a lawyer, so I don't want to pinch you here on that. But when it comes to the Supreme Court ruling, there was a couple of key things in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals that they basically sided with the industry on, and that there was this switcheroo, that there was a de facto, flavor ban, and that essentially the FDA and courts, but the FDA really specifically, acted arbitrarily and capriciously. And so did SCOTUS, deny those arguments, I guess? Is that really the key thing here?
They did, yeah. The court sided with FDA on those arguments, and in layman's terms, said that it wasn't arbitrary and capricious, and that the de facto flavor ban and those other aspects you just mentioned were all a acceptable and expected part of FDA's authority in the way it applies the statute. So, I mean, you could say they blessed it in that sense. Again, with the exception of the way that the agency misled manufacturers on marketing plans. So there's an aspect of it that remains undecided. But on the other aspects, yes, they did side with FDA, and frustratingly so, because so much of FDA's arguments there rely on what are pretty plain to see, misleading analysis, bogus arguments about risk and youth uptake, and so the court was obliged to accept FDA's expertise on those aspects, and it's frustrating because the expert points they were making were clearly based on complete bunk. Let's not forget there are other cases that are proceeding in other federal circuits that are zeroing in on the exact aspects that you're talking about. Whether and to what extent the agency can apply these standards to the appropriate for the protection of the public health. And so this is not the only bite at the apple. And there are other cases in other federal circuits that are, fighting along those other lines. And so there's a lot of battle left. That's for sure. And just last week, some of these justices, as you point out, in a separate case, were scorching the government's application of appropriate for the protection of the public in a completely different matter. And Justice Gorsuch was saying this is just, ridiculously vague and unworkable, and lets agencies color outside the lines in all sorts of improper ways.
Jim, what do we know about the circumstances behind Dr. King's ouster?
What happened behind the scenes, I think, remains a little bit unknown. There was no, it's tough to get the details, and people are piecing it together from various places. It looks as if there was sweeping overhaul of the leadership. The director of the Office of Science is gone. The head of the Center for Tobacco Products is gone. The entire media team, not just at CTP, but at FDA, gone, along with dozens of other personnel. And so it looks as if that overhaul is really sweeping. And Dr. King and Matthew Farrelly in the Office of Science were offered other opportunities elsewhere in the federal government, and I think they have a deadline, from what I understand, to decide on that, which is any day. So I think we'll know, it seems like we'll know by the end of the week whether they even remain in the federal government at all or not.
Right. So that says a lot. So this was a part of HHS Secretary Bobby Kennedy and his move to take out about 20,000 staff members from the agency. And he's hoping about 10,000 of those are going to be due to resignations, early retirement, and another 10,000 are going to be fired. And a large portion does seem to be coming from FDA.
Yeah, it certainly does. And, I can speak to the Center for Tobacco Products. That's the area where we're working. And I think it's a widely held view by nearly every stakeholder I know that sweeping reform is badly needed at CTP. And the intransigence, obstructionism, and really deeply misguided thinking that has been chronic at CTP for years now really needed to be dealt with. And I nearly everyone I know, with a few exceptions, nearly everyone I know who's been watching this closely is glad to see, decisive action being taken at long last.
Let me just read out a list here of based on our coverage over the last couple of years. What are all the things that Dr. King is kind of, accused of doing or not doing, which is also an issue. He blocked life-saving products. So he involved himself into the scientific process. Now, I know that he wasn't director of the agency during the actual office memo controversy in which scientists were basically muzzled, but he came in just months after that and perpetuated, certainly didn't fix that. And then over the course of his tenure, he failed to approve a single flavored vape used by adults. He let cigarettes stay on the shelf, and not only that, but approved over 900 new combustible products at the time that nothing was done for vaping. He essentially, in his enforcement discretion and so forth, helped bolster the black market. And he was kind of two-faced on harm reduction. I'll hand that back over to you.
Oh, yes. And you can put in the comment thread, AVM put out a long thread just yesterday that captures many of these examples of duplicity and misguided thinking and the widespread harm that the agency caused under his leadership. And it is a laundry list. I mean, it's really appalling. Let's not forget that when Dr. King was at Centers for Disease Control, he was part of the group that misnamed and mischaracterized the outbreak of lung injuries and falsely tied it to nicotine vaping, which caused not only a nationwide moral panic, also dissuaded countless Americans from switching to vaping from deadly combustible cigarettes, and never took responsibility for that, never explained his thinking, never wrote it back, never suggested that once the The science showed demonstrably that nicotine vaping had zero connection with that outbreak, never said anything about how it ought to be accurately conveyed to the public. And that's just, I mean, it's appalling. Don't forget, too, totally separate from that, he oversaw the disbursement of hundreds of millions of dollars to Madison Avenue advertising and public relations firms to run a nationwide campaign with brazen deceits about nicotine vaping. Again, which had contributed mightily to the deep public misperception about vaping. Under his tenure, the number of Americans who wrongly believe that vaping is as dangerous as smoking increased. I repeat, went up thanks to high nine-figure ad campaigns that he oversaw. And then, yes, just to touch on the duplicity in obscure forums like behind, paywalls at Politico or at conferences or in obscure academic journals, he would grudgingly admit, oh, yes, vaping is much safer than cigarettes and people would benefit from switching. But he never found the integrity to say that in a clear, loud voice to the public as a whole. And his every action outside of those esoteric venues was the exact opposite. And so, I mean, those are just a few major examples. I mean, there's a laundry list of others. We could go on for a long time talking about all of his negligence. But it shocks the conscience, I think.
In a rare moment of accountability, Dr. King appeared at an online event, I guess is the best way to put it, an interview that American vapor manufacturers had set up, and that was your team that was doing that, Allison Buchner and Greg Connolly. What did you take from that appearance that he did? Was he genuine and honest now? Or to be fair, to, I guess, the vaping side, was he duplicitous?
Well, I was struck as I was by many of his other public appearances, at just how practiced and studied his prevarications were. It's not just off the cuff or that he was able to spin in the moment. He had put careful, focused thought into the way he obscured the facts and evaded accountability. I mean, in that interview, it was like pulling teeth to get him to admit what is widely accepted in the scientific literature, that vaping is vastly safer and the most effective way to help people quit. And the reason you can tell that it's practiced is because the same kinds of talking points, the same kinds of phrasings are ones that he would use over and over again in different venues and different forums as a means to simply deflect questions without any real, commitment to the evidence or to helping American smokers. And so, it was both frustrating to see that kind of evasiveness, but also shocking in a way, because it was premeditated. Like he'd put a lot of thought into how to craft those evasions.
Let's take a listen to a couple of the sound bites and keep your ears open for how he handles the gateway issue. And with everything, it would always come back to the teens.
CTP has been describing teen vaping as an epidemic since 2018, a word that was chosen using focus groups to heighten the emotional reaction. But since then, teen vaping has plummeted, and today, fewer than 3% of teens vape daily. How do you expect to be taken seriously by the public as a scientific agency when you continue to use a flatly erroneous term like that?
Yeah, so I believe you're speaking about the CDC, and FDA has not used that terminology to use the most recent estimates of youth use. I will say that I'm an epidemiologist by training, so I'm fully cognizant of the definition of an epidemic, which is unprecedented increases over what you'd expected baseline. That said, I think and know that the science has shown a decline in the number of youth users, and that's a good thing. I do disagree with the notion that we should only be concerned with daily use among kids. We do have research that demonstrate even infrequent use elicit signs and symptoms of dependency. And so from my perspective, any youth use of these products is problematic, and that, that's how you become a frequent user is there's a pathway from intermediary to frequent use. And I'm hopeful that we can continue these types of interventions to continue to reduce youth use, but it's not mutually exclusive from actions to help continue to address the issue of harm reduction among adult smokers and getting them to quit completely.
So you agree?
On your watch, sorry, Allison. So on your watch, the FDA has decided to no longer use the term epidemic.
Since I've started, I haven't uttered it. I'm not aware of any of my staff, but as far as I'm aware, we have not used the term. It's ultimately up to respective individuals. There's certainly disagreements among epidemiologists, like there is any discipline. You're going to find people disagree. But in terms of the big picture issue, I don't want us to see the forest beyond the trees. And the bottom line is that there's still too many kids using these products. And so whatever you call it, we've got 2.5 million kids using the products, and we can do better in terms of reducing them. And so I don't want us to get caught up in semantics so much as the big picture. And for me, we've got more work to do. We've made good progress, but we've got to continue to the pedal to the metal while still keeping an open mind around strategies continue to benefit adult smokers to get them to quit completely.
While you were at the CDC in the mid-2010s, many people's first introduction to you came when, along with Dr. Tom Frieden, you started to voice warnings that vaping products could serve as a gateway to combustible cigarette smoking. Today, of course, high school cigarette smoking is at 2%, a figure that no doubt would have inspired great laughs at any tobacco control conference in 2010 if you predicted that's where we'd be at today. Because back then, 1 in 7 high school youth smoked cigarettes. So with the benefit of 7-8 years of hindsight, in your view, is it a fair conclusion that any gateway into smoking over the last decade has likely been outsized numerically by the gateway out of smoking for youth and young adults?
I will say that there's still a strong body of evidence that suggests that the gateway does exist, but it's dependent on a variety of different factors. It's certainly not conclusive evidence, but there's moderate evidence to demonstrate that. But you also have to look at the net impact of the science. And so I've said publicly many times that you do have some gateway effect. We've seen that through the PATH study and others, but that doesn't mean that every single kid who's using an e-cigarette is going to go on to smoke. There's a variety of factors that impact that. So I caution folks against, definitive statements like that every person is going to transition who use the products. It's certainly happening. But when you look at the net effect, we've definitely seen a decline in overall e-cigarette use. But that doesn't negate the fact that there still may be some kids who are using e-cigarettes that are transitioning to cigarettes. But the net effect at present, we are seeing a decline in use. And as I noted earlier, I hope that continues among kids. It's a good thing, but we can do better.
Yeah, and everything or much of your day is spent looking at the 100-word statute that's known as the Appropriate for the Protection of Public Health test for the PMTA, for PMTA reviews. This is a question kind of inspired by thoughts of Dr. David Abrams, formerly of the Truth Initiative, people like David Levy. Does the Appropriate for the Protection of Public Health statute require FDA to view teens switching away from cigarettes to vaping as a bad thing?
I think that there's a lot of interpretations of APPH, and I think that we have opportunities to continue to clarify the scope of that. I know there's been a lot of calls in the past. I do hope for opportunities in the future where we can have public engagement on entities to identify perspectives related to the precision around the APPH standard.
So you didn't really necessarily answer the question. Do you think the APPH statute requires FDA to say any teen use of any nicotine product, including a switch from cigarettes to vaping, is a bad thing? Is that required by the statute, or is that a policy-based decision?
The statute requires us to look at the net benefits and risk when we are making a decision on a PMTA, and that includes evaluating the benefits to adult smokers, but also the net risk to kids. And so we are required to look at that relationship. And so in terms of determining the APPH standard, we have to look at the net impact among non-users, and that includes youth, which is a vulnerable population.
So King at one point said we are transparent and science-based in our evaluations of these products.
Well, I mean, that's not true. That's untrue. And not just according to me or AVM, his own scientific staff, whistleblowers there, told the Reagan-Udall auditors that the CTP leadership rigged the outcomes of some of the studies, altered the findings of others, rebuked any dissent from those scientists when they objected to having their work mangled in that way. And so it's just plainly untrue. And the other point to be made here is that they're operating on a standard that's completely opaque. Again, it's appropriate for the protection of the public health. It's one of the flashcards he constantly holds up. Well, that could mean anything. And there's no measurability there. The actual yardstick that they're using behind the scenes is entirely unknown to the applicants. And of course, that means it's open to political influence and ideological influence and this kind of Puritan moral antipathy that people like King have for nicotine use. And so they can just fill in any blank that they want. So to claim that he's a rigorous adherent to science, it's a cheap talking point that doesn't even have any, substantiated basis. It's offensive.
And we certainly know that King has met with, congressional members that are clearly anti-vaping. Does he have links, do you think, to Bloomberg?
Well, look, I mean, it's okay for him to meet with members of Congress, and I think, and that's entirely appropriate. And to be fair, he met with a lot of other stakeholders, us included, as you pointed out. But again, people in his own team, the FDA's own staff, told the Reagan-Udall audit that the regulatory process there wasn't just like he was influenced or persuaded by a meeting with Senator Durbin or other officials on Capitol Hill. They told the auditors that those political officials were strong-arming the decisions and that the agency itself was willingly going along with that. I mean, the Reagan-Udall audit itself concluded that it was politicized in a corrupt way. I mean, again, let me emphasize, that's not just meeting with a congressman and being persuaded. That's political corruption. And what's more, behind the scenes, out of public view, Dr. King and his boss, Dr. Califf, were meeting with the most hardline anti-vape fanatics in the world. Groups like American Lung Association and Tobacco Free Kids. I mean, when the Reagan-Udall audit came out, the first thing that the leadership at FDA did was meet with those fanatics so that they could coordinate their spin and their response to the report. I mean, it's just appalling. So the political influence there was deep, and highly irresponsible. I mean, a massive disservice to the American public and a breach of the trust in those institutions that's already so fragile. I mean, it's hard to overstate just how reckless that was.
Do you think that Dr. King ever had the intention of engaging with the industry in good faith?
No, I don't. And I think his tenure at CDC and the way he took part in the Valley debacle is strong evidence of that. Obviously, he was handpicked by the previous leadership at CTP, people like Mitch Zeller and Dr. Califf, both of whom are longtime hardline anti-nicotine fanatics. And let's remember, King was woefully underqualified for this role. I mean, that was a commonly held view when his name was put forward initially about just how thin his resume and background was. So it seems obvious that he was chosen for his ideological outlook and his reliability on that Puritan prohibition outlook that has stained CTP's approach for so many years.
Well, it's hard to have been excited about Dr. King's, reign over the cigarette and vaping industries. Though what's funny is that I've seen in the mainstream media, reporting on this that, the Office of, Office Center for Tobacco Products never took taxpayer money. They were only funded by Big Tobacco. And at this point, I'm just like, that is the definition of regulatory capture. I don't care if it was written into an agreement and it's transparent. It's just insane that that's the case.
You're right. It makes it worse. That's right. All those voices are offering that as if it's some kind of mitigation or an excuse. It makes it worse. And here's why, because 100% of their budget relies on keeping the market for combustible tobacco going. And even if they're not doing it in some mustache twisting Machiavellian way, that's a huge, gigantic incentive. I mean, again, AVM's not the only one making this case. This is the whole foundation of an entire school of economic thought, which is called public choice theory. I mean, that won the Nobel Prize in the 1970s. That's a widely understood phenomenon, that the way that bureaucracies operate in this way, and you cannot have a more glaring, misguided incentive than having 100% of your budget dependent on a particular market and then expected to regulate a competitor to that market. I mean, it's lunatic.
Well, and expected to actually destroy that market. The whole idea is supposed to be end smoking.
That's right. I mean, and that's the philosophical goal here that I think, so many of us share from all sorts of different vantage points in nicotine policy world. And yet these guys at CTP have been driving that car off of a cliff, away, instead of steering straight toward that goal. And that's another great point to be made here, is that, whatever mandate or directives that the FDA has from Congress, they often, you'll see King fall back on that excuse. I'm just doing what Congress tells me to do, don't you know? Sorry, not my fault. But he's had all the latitude in the world to make a philosophical case or characterize the way that the market is acting or talk about moral aims. Indeed, he does that in all sorts of other ways. But never do you hear him talk about why it's important to have people, switch to safer forms of nicotine, or that, gosh, I really regret the way that misnaming EVALI might have scared Americans from doing it. I mean, even in their priorities, Dr. Califf and Dr. King both insisted all this time that fighting misinformation was their top priority, they said. And yet not once, we tracked this closely, not a single time did either of those gentlemen ever set straight a syllable of misinformation about vaping in the public discourse. So that tells you all you need to know about their integrity.
Well, just last year, the former FDA commissioner, Robert Califf, said in congressional testimony that tobacco harm reduction was an industry plot.
It's incredible. I mean, even as he was claiming to want to fight misinformation, he would do public forums. And again, I'll give you a link to a whole thread we did on this, in which he was, brazenly obscuring the harm differences between vaping and smoking. Not only was he not clearing up misinformation, he and Brian King were super spreaders of misinformation about vaping.
I just want to loop back, Jim, for a second to that point you said earlier in the interview about how sweeping these changes were. So the entire FDA media team is gone. The Center for Tobacco Products, are the scientists still there, or they just wiped the executives? Like,
I think a lot of that remains to be seen. It appears as though it was mostly the leadership team at CTP in the Office of Science. It's true, I think, that the entire public relations and comms teams was replaced. And look, it's an incoming administration, and they've got every right to want to have their own people and their own approach and their own policy. And to my mind, there's very little doubt that the path that this previous team at CTP was, the direction they were leading it in was catastrophic. So I think it makes a lot of good sense to make a sweeping change right at the outset and start fresh. So the full extent of it remains to be seen, but I think in its direction and intent, it certainly seems sensible, and from where we sit, long overdue.
So, Jim, we've got the new FDA commissioner, Dr. Makary, and Joe Gitchell, if you're out there listening, and if I mispronounce that, please let me know. And so he's installed. We have Jay Bhattacharya installed at the NIH. We have, obviously, the new HHS secretary, Mr. Kennedy. So now all of the rungs are being cleared out of senior execs that are underneath. And if all the whole media teams are cleared out, I can't possibly see that this isn't at least a tee up for potentially Trump making good in some manner on his promise to say vaping.
Yeah, I mean, it's tempting to think that, and I would like to think so. I mean, there's been some troubling indications on the other side of the ledger too, during the new FDA commissioner's testimony, for example, during his confirmation hearings. He was pressed by senators, about what to do with vaping. The first thing out of his mouth was that, oh, well, FDA has a lot of enforcement agents with guns. And so it seemed to lean very heavily on this, drug war style, heavy handed enforcement. And, what's called for here, I think, is to, enable upstanding, responsible American entrepreneurial companies to do what they know how to do best, and which is provide safer nicotine alternatives for adults who want to quit smoking. And so, how it plays out remains to be seen. But yes, it would seem like this is a step in the right direction. And, let's hope that they can craft, a reasonable, sensible policy that enables any company to have a reasonable, fair shot of getting an application through, and then, going into the market in a responsible way.
Do you think it's possible that the whole PMTA system could be, revised or possibly thrown out?
Yeah, very possible, and it ought to be. I mean, this ludicrous steeplechase that the FDA, the previous regime at FDA, has set up, has led to just so many bad outcomes: nationwide bankruptcies, countless Americans cast back to cigarettes, public deceit. It's cost millions and millions of dollars for small businesses, small American businesses, to try to get an application through. And then, of course, as we warned them, the rise of gray and black markets, which are now, all over the place. So there's a whole host of problems that resulted from this ludicrous Rube Goldberg contraption that the predecessors have set up. So yeah, they ought to start fresh, and it's not that hard to do. I mean, there's been many, very carefully laid out proposals for how to go about this. Like Clive Bates, we can recommend. I'll give you the tweet we did about his proposals, but they could set, product standards. They could have a very measurable application process that lets manufacturers know exactly what to expect when they go into that process. So it could be done in a very straightforward fashion. And yeah, now's the time to do it. So I'm optimistic they will put a new approach in place.
Well, they certainly can't continue to just approve new combustible products and ignore vaping.
I mean, that's a key point here, which is another part of what they're trying to do, it would seem, is restore public trust in these institutions. The Centers for Disease Control, the FDA, and the Center for Tobacco Products have spent the last number of years absolutely torching their own credibility by misleading the public, speaking down to people in this arrogant, condescending way, depriving Americans of life-saving products. I mean, there's the endless public deceit and the lack of accountability and transparency. So part of what the new administration clearly trying to do is restore trust and say to the American public, we're going to start fresh, and we're going to, replace the administrators that were behaving in that way. And I think, yeah, part of that, means shooting straight with the public. When the Americans see combustible tobacco getting waved through while, vastly safer products that have, injured or killed precisely no one are being restricted, that's a ridiculous disconnect that ought to be sorted out if we're going to restore faith in these public health institutions.